Good evening. Welcome to the Chronicles of Rahm. I'm your host, Alan Campbell at IntellectualRadio.com. Tonight, we are going to get into a conversation about our communities, not just a community, but our communities. That could be anyone, Black, white, Hispanic, because the term communities stems from the Latin word communitas, meaning common people. But how do we try to rectify certain things in our communities? We hear all the time about social injustice, police brutality, economic decline, but how do we combat that? We have one area of our city that's in such a decline it's ridiculous, but then there are other parts of our city that are constantly growing. But sometimes we find ourselves um, conversating with the wrong people or not talking to the right people about how we can combat this. See, I'm a product of the city of Chicago. I grew up in Roseland, which visiting this area a few weeks back, and I was just amazed at how it just completely seemed like a demilitarized zone. And for those who don't know what a demilitarized zone, that means that's an area that you're not supposed to be in or nobody goes to because there's nothing there. Absolutely nothing there. So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss a few things, even open up the phone lines at some point to where we can talk about this as an open forum to where how do we combat this? We hear all the time, the news is just completely inundated with violence. Inglewood. When you unfortunately you associate violence with Inglewood, violence with Austin, violence with Garfield Park, violence with Roseland, violence with as these particularly and predominantly black communities. Black communities. Where are our political leaders? Where are the clergy? No one says anything. Not one single thing. Where are these people at? And then when you rob these communities of jobs, resources, anything that will give them hope, when you rob an individual of hope, he's left with what? Hopelessness. So then they resort back to what they know or how to go about it. We may say, oh, well, a guy's got to make a living. He's got to feed his family. True. I wouldn't frown on a person at all of trying to do what he has to do because you've left him with no options. Zero options. The jails are full of individuals who were left with no option. None. So this individual commits a crime, gets an astronomical bond that he can't pay, his family can't pay because they're in an area that's so dilapidated or been robbed of those things. So he sits there. Or if he does make bond, he gets out, he has nothing. So what is he supposed to do? How do we do this? What are we to do? We talk to our leaders and it's as if it's on deaf ears because everyone is out for themselves. How do we restructure our community? Years ago when we had communities, we had what we call a block captain. And that was just one person who was either took it upon themselves or the block delegated this individual to be the eyes and ears of that block. And sometimes it might even extend to maybe 2 or 3 blocks, and then people congregated, they got together, they had a common interest of keeping the community safe. This is where our men come in to where they were the protectors. Years ago, where in the community, if you saw a child doing something, clowning, doing things that they weren't supposed to do, that individual would take them down the block to their parents' house and tell them what they did. You can't do that anymore. You can't even talk to somebody's kids. You can't even talk to some of these kids because they have been sidetracked from any type of upbringing because the community has fallen apart. They see these things around them. The question is, what do we do? How do we combat this? How do we combat this as people in these areas that are not, that are pretty much thrown away? They're back. People have turned their backs on them. What do we do? How do we go about that? How do we do it? I don't have an answer, but I see it all the time when I'm going to work, where I'm going to, wherever I may be going to. It's not so much as a people problem, it is a community situation. You can put a cop on every corner in America. You're still not going to combat the situation. You have to give people options, resources, and when those resources are taken away, they're left with nothing. But when you're introducing other options, weapons, drugs, liquor stores, these are things to where they feel they need to have an escape so they can deal with the realities of what they don't have, of what they don't have. If you go just outside, if you go west of the city, you'll see that the further west you go, the more livable, the more say, hey, this is a place I like to live. I like to live out here. Some places even far south. Definitely if you go far north. Look at those communities. Those are people who share a common interest. Hey, we're not going to allow certain things, or we're going to take back our community. Also, we have to start. If you see something, say something. That's another problem. That's another thing within the community. We're not taking it back. We're not taking the communities back. Years ago, there would never be a point to where you would hear about children, just children. 3 children in 1 week were slain due to violence. And these are underserved communities. Underserved. You would never hear anything like that 20, 30 years ago. It was unheard of. Absolutely unheard of. And you try to wrap your head around it, but it's very, very difficult to do because you're trying to make sense out of senselessness. You're trying to make heads or tails out of what is happening. Why is this happening? Why is this happening? We are being robbed of these things. The other part is the breakdown in the home, to where you may have two parents, you might have one parent, but there is an obvious breakdown within the home between raising a child, the communication between the two parents, and that translating to outside to where they can become productive. It's a breakdown. The breakdown begins when when resources are not there. They are not there at all. A lot of us are fortunate to come from a two-parent home. Fortunate. But if you come from a one-parent home, it's a strain on that one parent between going to work, making sure this child or children are getting the schooling, the education that they need, the meals that they need, and the attention that is needed for them to proceed on is being taken from them, or it's gone lacking. It has gone lacking. And that's not by anyone's own fault. They're doing the best that they can. Hopefully, at some point or another, that we can figure out what to do, how to go about it. It's not going to be an overnight process. Like anything, it is a process that gradually has to pick up steam. It has to work, but everyone has to pitch in. Going back to the term community, shared common interests, a shared common interest. That's how it's done. Someone has to Take the first step, meet me halfway. Take another step. We all get there. We will all get there together. We can't get there by ourselves. We all work together. And this is how it's done, how we have to do it, how it's done from start, middle to the end. This is how it's done. We can't do it if we're constantly standing on the sidelines and expecting someone else to do it for us. We can't expect police to do it. It's not their job. Police, their job is to enforce policy, enforce the laws. That's all there are. That's all they are, is enforcers. Fortunately, some have taken the word enforcement beyond the natural term. Then we get to the part of our politicians. The politicians are just as responsible for the decline of a community, because what happens, you have an individual that's been in office for 10, 15, sometimes 20 years, and nothing has changed, but we continue to put these people back in. That's not smart. That is not smart thinking by any means. It's like if you're at a job and you're not performing at a level that they hired you for, what happens? They get rid of you. This is how we have to do things as a community, as a whole, as a collective. This is where it starts. You have to start. You have to find out what the problem is, identify the problem. Then once you identify the problem, then you come up with a solution. Every problem has a solution. We just have to find it. That's all we have. That's the fastest way. That is definitely the way to do it. And finding out what the problem is looking at everything as a whole. Some of it may not be pretty. Some of it we have to take a hard look. Or as they say, the good, look at the bad, and look at the ugly. And unfortunately, the ugly is where everything is. That's what we have to do. There are even communities outside of the city of Chicago that are underserved. Fort Heights, one of the poorest cities in the county of Cook, poorest. That city is 8 blocks long in each direction. Poorest. That's at the farthest end. Right behind that is Chicago Heights, to the point where they can barely afford to pay their police and fire department. Those are first responders, but they can afford to pay. They can barely afford to pay them. But yet these communities manage to stick together, work towards a common goal. And that's the betterment of that community. The other thing is we have to address the economic decline in these communities, which is why they are in the state that they are. But when you have individuals that are in political power and they either hands are tied or they don't care, because most of them don't live in that community, so they can't see it from their house. So it's not my concern. It's not what I don't want to be bothered with it. Really don't want to be bothered. But I'm very passionate about my community. I'm very passionate about my city. And we have to move towards rectifying that in order to get better. In order to get better, we have to do better. And we can't do it by sitting on the sidelines or being a Monday morning quarterback. We just can't. At some point, we have to say, one, enough is enough. We have to take a hard line and look at ourselves. We have to look at our community, why our community is the way it is. We hear all the time, if you know something, see something, say something. Do you know where your children are at whatever time it may be when it's after dark? Do you know where they're at? If they're not in front of you, you need to know what they're doing, because that's a community problem. Time and time again, how often have we sat there and watched on the news and we heard about someone's child being involved in an incident at 11 o'clock at night, when you're saying to yourself, why wasn't he at home? Why wasn't she at home? Or they were coming back from someplace. What are you doing? Why were you there? This is a community. This is how you take control. This is how you're able to root out certain situations. If you know that your child or children are not in your house at 10 o'clock, 11 or 10 o'clock on a school night, and 11 on a weekend, if they're not at some friend's house saying, hey, this is where I'm at, mom or dad, this is what I'm doing, you need to find out where they're at. Because if they're into something, that's part of the problem. Definitely. Everyone is bad, or just out there doing anything, but when you know where that, it eliminates the problem. You have a handle on it. Community. I can't, and that's where it begins, within our community. When they started with public housing, such as Robert Taylor, uh, the Argyle Gardens, Ida B. Wells, Cabrini Green. The idea for that, the idea, the purpose was to keep a group of people centrally located in one area. But it ultimately became a community amongst the people who lived there. It became that particular community. You had your grocery stores, your doctor's office, you had your cleaners, your laundromats, you had your meat markets. Everything was right there. So it was no need for you to go outside of that little area. No need. All I did was to keep you centrally located. We don't want you over here, but we're going to give you enough so you don't have to come out. We're going to give you that. And each development, that's how it was designed originally, for that purpose. Then you wind up having 3 and 4 and 5 generations of people, to where they became complacent and say, well, now we don't want to move. Now what happens is no longer a community. It becomes an entire city within itself, because now people have been conditioned and limited to stay in that area and not think outside the eight block radius. They're not there. That's a cultural conditioning that happens to people, or they say groomed into it. This is one of the things that winds up happening. There's an upside, and then there's a downside. But you have to work at, or try to decipher which is which. Hey, do I want to live here all my life, or do I want to do something different? Do I want to spread out a little bit? How do I want to do this? How? How do we work with our law enforcement community? Keyword, law enforcement community. How do we work with them? How does the community work with law enforcement community? Unfortunately, the law enforcement community has made it difficult for us to do that. Very difficult, because of things that we are now seeing, that we have been talking about for decades. But it makes it difficult to do now. Very difficult. But at some point, someone has to sit down someone has to be the first one to sit down at the table and say, let's try to work this out. Let's try to get an understanding on moving forward. You need us, we need them. If the community doesn't exist, law enforcement doesn't exist. One hand washes the other, so to speak. One hand washes the other. And that's really the start in helping redevelop the community. We have to work with one another. Just today, the city of Chicago um, has allocated $4 million in grant money for these underserved communities. $4 million, and these communities, and actually it's actually for the South Side. It's actually dedicated for the South Side, West Side, and the Southeast Side. So all of these communities that are underserved. And when I say the South Side, West Side, and Southeast, those are areas of South Shore, Inglewood, Pullman, Garfield Park, which is on the West Side, Austin. This is money now. What they're and which is a good thing, but when you look at it, why now do you want to give us this money? Why now do you want to give this money for community development? Say, oh yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to give you this. We're going to give you that. Is this to help us build, or is this basically a token of good faith to say, well, we just have to do this so we can keep everybody happy? They just done this today, $4 million with a maximum of 250,000 for developing, and it's just for these communities only. Which is, you may say it's a good thing, but where was this money 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when you were doing all the building and developing in downtown Chicago, on the outskirts of downtown, when you were building up West Loop near North? Why wasn't that money distributed evenly to communities that need these resources, that need jobs, that need trade schools, that need food stores? Because the majority of these communities are food deserts. A food desert, meaning that there is no store within walking distance of someone, within 2 block walk distance of someone's home, which means that you're either on a car or you're on a bus going to grocery shop. You got to do that. But they make sure that there's plenty fast food restaurants within walking distance of that 2 blocks. Liquor stores. Just today, I saw 2 liquor stores within 50 feet of each other on the same strip of land. The same strip. Is that helping the community? I highly doubt it. I highly doubt it. Not at all. Not at all. But now we have this money, and we definitely want to see what's going to happen. And at some point, someone has to be held accountable. And we have to start holding people accountable for why our communities are in the disarray that they are. And that's from the top on down. That's from the seat of government all the way down to precinct captains, aldermen, whoever they may be. There has to be levels of accountability. And that's not being done. And when you don't have accountability, you have what we call rapid spending, or we just don't care, as long as it doesn't affect me. So we're going to open up the phone lines. We're going to take a little break, a small music break here on iHeart Intellectual Radio, the Chronicles of Rahm. You can call in at 708-223-8953. That's 708-223-8953. We'll be right back. Welcome back to iHeart Internet Intellectual Radio. If you want to follow us, go to www.com, intellectualradio.com. You are listening to the Chronicles of Ron. We are talking about the survival of our community. And I stress the word our community that is on the downside of a very, very bad landslide falling off into the ocean here. If you've never seen a landslide, pull it up on YouTube. Go to California. It will be the most amazing thing you will ever see. Because why? There's nothing you can do to stop it. We're going to open up the phone lines. We're taking your calls. I am taking your calls. Once again, that number is 708-223-8953, Intellectual Radio. We are discussing communities. As far as developing, we have to find resources, but at the same time, we have to work on keeping certain things out of the community. There was an article some time ago with a particular railroad going through a particular community, and this railroad let me rephrase that. This railroad began buying up all the adjacent land. And what happens when the railroad buys land? It becomes federal property. That means that when your house that railroad has bought, it becomes property of the federal government. So what happens is that they enacted what they call a term called eminent domain, which means that they can take that property or an house that you may have already paid for, lived in, bought, grew up in, whatever it may be. They can take it without, key word in there, they can take it, and there's nothing you can do. Nothing. If you don't believe me, look up the word eminent domain. That means they're taking it, and they do not need a court order. They don't need your permission. They come in and say, hey, guess what? Get out. You got to go today. But what this railroad was doing was buying up all the land in the adjacent area, and at the same time taking buildings, homes from people, so they can expand their yard, what I prefer to call their empire. But to expand that, not to mention, here's the other thing, when you have certain goods coming into that yard or into that rail yard that tend to go missing and end up in the community, because this railroad, this yard, runs through the particular communities that we have been talking about earlier. And when you have these things happen or certain goods go missing, something is wrong that these things are not reported. How is that? There was an incident to where a container of firearms went missing. How does that happen? How does that happen? A container, a 53-foot container. For those who are not familiar with that, when you're sitting at a railroad crossing and the train is going by, you realize you don't see boxcars anymore. You do, they're so rare, but you see two metal boxes, one stacked on top of each other. Those are containers, ranging anywhere from 28 feet to 53 feet. And in those containers, one of those containers was loaded with, had firearms that went missing. How does that happen? And these firearms wind up in the community or in the hands of people who shouldn't have them. I'm sorry, but nobody mentioned that. That wasn't newsworthy. There's an old saying, it has to be newsworthy before it becomes truthworthy. But it ends up in this community. Nothing, I don't believe in the term, happenstance, I'm not a proponent of that, but it does happen. When you have these things, and these are things that are happening in these communities. If you look at some of these communities of where these rail yards run through, they run through a lot of underserved communities. Pullman, Roseland, Argyle, Inglewood, Fuller Park. They run through it. They definitely run through it. Oh, not to mention when you're going west, Garfield Park particularly runs right through the heart of the west side. But when you have these things happen, nobody talks about it. Because why? These are things that they want to happen to see the decline of these communities. That's why it's imperative as people who live in the community to what I said at the beginning to come together. Community, a group of people living in a particular area who share a common interest. If you care about your community, that's the part that you have a job. You have a job. You have a job to do. Years ago, the men were they were the protectors, as I said earlier. But at the same time, they were also the people who went and talked to the community leaders. They talked to clergy. They were able, at one point, they were able to have open dialogue with law enforcement to say, hey, we have a problem we need to address. They were able to go to their precinct captains, their automatic individuals. We have a problem. We need for you to do something about that. And it was done. It was taken care of. You take certain community, look at a prime example of a community taking care of itself, Lincoln Park, Wrigleyville. Just you go up there and you will see the development. You will see the economic growth. The economic growth. They're building a hotel right next to Wrigley Field. Wrigley Field building. And the rest of the economic growth that is going on in that little community. Because why? This is a community working together. This is what we want. These other communities, we can do the same thing. We just have to apply ourselves. And when we don't apply ourselves, expect what to happen. Expect people to come in and say, hey, no, we're going to do this, or hey, we're going to do that. We're going to take this. We're going to take that. The other downside, now we're going to really get into the real ugly part of the community, is that when you have a black-owned store, we won't buy, or we will go, or said no, certain individuals, undesirables, will go into the store and try to rob them. But you're not going to go across town and commit a crime in that other store. But we have a problem. We take from each other. Stealing, period, taking from anyone is I don't condone, and it's wrong. But we do it to each other, which helps inundate the problem of the decline of our community. Because what happens, this individual no longer wants to do business in this community because it's gotten out of hand. And what does he do? He uproots, closes the store, and he goes. What happens now? Jobs leaves, and then resources leave. This is the problem. We can't address a problem if we're not willing to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. We can't. There's no way possible. We have to address that. It has to be addressed. This is where you go into your aldermanic office, wherever they may be, and you sit down. You have a discussion. You have at least you're supposed to have that type of open dialogue. When you go in, you sit down. Hey, chit chat. This is what we have. We have a problem. How come we don't have this over here? How come this is not happening? How come our parks are looking the way they are? How come our streets are looking the way they are? How come we have buildings that are just in such dilapidated conditions or unoccupied that they're allowed to stand? And not so much even in Chicago, but even surrounding towns, Harvey, Markham, Dalton, Robbins, and you drive through some of these towns and you just ask yourself, how is this even possible that on one block every house is vacant or burned out or destroyed? How is this even possible? The other side to that is that when people who are in power, who are supposed to be helping taking care of this, are not. The problem becomes where some people get greedy, lining their pockets. They're not spreading the wealth around. Well, they've lost. This is not people that lost their way. This is people who become greedy and feel that, well, this is mine and I don't want to share it. I don't want to share it. And there's a problem with that because these are people in power. And what happens is that when if we continue to see this in a community, but we continue to go to the polls and we vote these people back in, is that smart thinking? Is that real? Is that smart? Is that realistically thinking the way I want to think? No, of course not. Of course not. There's a particular town right now that is in such dire straits because the seat of government has completely run through federal funds, municipal funds, TIFs, all the money that there is, and this town has no economic development, zero development, no jobs, no resources. When you have city workers running to the bank to cash their checks so they won't bounce, that is a problem. This is the ugly side of what of community is. We wind up hamstringing one another because we feel disenfranchised or we feel left out. But does that solve our problems? No, it doesn't. Does not solve our problems at all. If we look around and say, how, what are we doing? What are we doing to ourselves? What are we doing to our community? At the same time, we have to take into consideration in these communities that are completely destroyed, we have our daughters that walk through this community, our mothers, our wives or girlfriends that walk through this community. And some are absolutely afraid to do this. This is why it's imperative that we have to take the communities back from whomever are holding it. And I use this term, holding it hostage, because that's exactly for some people what it feels like, being held hostage. I can't go out on my front stoop in fear of somebody having a bad day and discharging a firearm, or just walking by because they're having some type of mental breakdown and create a problem. There are things that we have to look at as a people and saying, we have to address this. We have to stop relying on other people to come in and solve our problems. Some of our problems are self-made. Others are generated. But it has to start with us. Has to start with us. That old saying, we started from the bottom, now we're here. Well, the problem is that we're still at the bottom. We are still at the bottom. We have to figure out how to get to the top. And at the same time, when we see a few people trying to get to the top, we can't get into we have to get away from, well, I'm going to pull him back down. The mentality, crabs in a barrel. The idea is that we're supposed to, it's teach one, it's reach one, teach one. We have to demand better from our schools. In the community, we have to demand better. Demand better. When you see that, hey, something is not happening, something is not right with your child, you know your child is on point, but it just doesn't seem like he's getting the education or he's understanding the lesson, then we need to look at what's wrong. Sometimes it's not the child, sometimes it's the program. But we have to start at somewhere. We have to take charge. We have to apply ourselves. I can't stress that enough. Apply ourselves. For years, we have sat by and been the Monday morning quarterback and say, oh, I would have done this, I would have done that. Well, did you get in the game? What did you do to change the situation? What did you do? How do you go? What did you do? Sometimes we stand by idly and just wait for something to happen or wait for someone to come in and rectify the situation instead of doing it ourselves. There was a time where men and women worked together to solve a common problem because his problem was her problem. Her problem was his problem. Then it became their problem. And then if it was a bigger problem than the community, then everybody got involved. Everyone got involved. Everyone. So, as the old African proverb says, that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, that child is the community. He or she, they are the community. And it starts with us. It starts with teaching them the proper way. It starts with teaching them from the cradle. It starts there. It starts as a community within the household. That's the first community, because you see these people every day. Parents cannot be friends with their children. You have to be parents. You can't have a mother and daughter that are friends. You can't have them what I call twinning, where they're both going to the same clothing store and buying the exact same thing. What are you teaching? You're teaching the wrong thing. You want them to understand that there's a level of responsibility. Fathers, teaching your boys how to become men, men, men. To understand that this is your job, to take care of your home. Your first job is take care of your home, which is your first community. Then you're able to take care of a community outside of that. And it starts right there. The two have to work hand in hand. But when they've been groomed to work against each other, this makes it very difficult to move forward. Very difficult. Very, very difficult. Then what happens is that one or the other, well, this is what I don't want to be bothered with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to destroy the community because I don't like the way things are. Or I'm going to destroy the community because I can. Community. People sharing a common interest in a particular area. That is in the home or outside the home. We have to build from this. We have to understand how, first and foremost, in order to build, you have to understand how to build. You have to have a foundation. And the foundation is within ourselves. Within ourselves, to where we work together, commune. Then we're able to work outside of that to build our community, to say what we no longer will tolerate or accept. Give us those jobs. Give us the same jobs that you're giving the other side of town, or the other side of town, or the other towns that are next door to us. Give us that. Give us those funds so we can build, so we can develop. When you take one particular store, when you drop a whole food store in the middle of a dilapidated community, that's not helping develop. That's just a token of saying we're thinking about you and we'll get you something else when we get around to it. That's what that is. Oh, we're going to put this here. No, 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 no. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. That's the part where we have to see it for what it really is. We have to open our eyes and say, wait a minute, this is not acceptable. This is not enough. Because when you go on the other side of town and they're putting up a complete, not just a store, but a center to where there's not only where it's food or produce, but it's clothing and other amenities. One store compared to 10 stores doesn't add up. Doesn't add up. And you think you're doing something by putting it directly in the heart of this particular community. You put a Whole Food in the middle of Inglewood. Well, everybody can come there and this, that, and the other. That's like a carrot, holding a carrot out in front of a horse so you can get it to do what you want it to do. I call that buying votes, bait and switch. That's not helping a community. That's keeping a community in your pocket. That's keeping a community held down to say, oh, well, he did this, so we're good. No. If you're starving, if you're starving and someone hands you a crust of bread with a little bit of spread on it, are you supposed to be grateful? No. To me, that's an insult. I'll give you another crust when I think it's time. We have to stop accepting what is being given to us. We have to apply and say, no, this is not acceptable. Not. And our communities are in such disarray that it's no longer acceptable. But what's happened is that we begin to accept it. We become desensitized. We become immune to the point to where, oh, this happens every day. Every day. Oh, this is okay. Oh, this is all right. That's not smart thinking. That's not. When you have a breakdown in the community of the home, you have a breakdown in the community of the block. And when the block breaks down, you have a breakdown in the community of the rest of the blocks. And then it fans out. There has to be a point to where we have to take this back. We have to make corrections. The problem comes in is that now these communities are so out of control because they've been allowed to get out of control. So now you bring in Johnny Law or law enforcement to quell the disturbance, and then he does what he does. Because now he's been brought in to handle a situation that he's not even familiar with. Because why? He doesn't live there, so he doesn't understand. This is not a knock to the police department or any department, but they have to understand the people that they have been um, put in charge of. They have to understand who they're dealing with. And when you don't have that instilled, or when there's lack of training, for example, there was a report that CB that was released that police training. They were looking at a police training video, and I kid you not, that was 35 years old, and they're having new cadets coming through looking at a video that is 35 years old. That's out of date policing. That's out of date dealing with people right now. That's a there lies a problem. So when they come in with old style tactics, what do you think is going to happen? People are going to respond. When they come in with negative tactics and old style ways, people are going to respond in negative. They're going to respond in a negative way. It's only natural. When you have people that are oppressed, when you have the oppressor, the oppressed is going to fight back, which they're already upset because they're living in a economically destroyed community. They have been robbed. Their hope has been robbed. Now you're coming in and you're telling me that we can't do this or I'm going to do that. People are going to fight back. They're going to push back. They're going to do that. There has to be a point to where we look at this and we go from there. But with that being said, I hope that everyone listening have got a better idea or perspective on what you can do better in your community. How can we do better? How can you do better in and around your community? Take pride in where you live. Take pride in what you do. Know where your children are. Know what they're doing. Know, most importantly, know who your children are associating with. Know who they are associating with, and you can, then that way you get a better handle on that. Better handle on that. So, with that being said, this is the Chronicle. This is the Chronicles of Ron on Intellectual Radio. If you want to log in, go to www.com, intellectualradio.com. This is Alan Campbell signing off for the Chronicles of Ron.